Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the first webinar in the COP31 Insights series today. My name is Ümit Şahin. I'm the head of the climate change program at the Istanbul Policy Center in Sabancı University in Istanbul. As COP31 approaches, we have begun organizing a set of preparatory events as Istanbul Policy Center. And one of our main aims is to facilitate dialogue between Turkish and international climate policy communities on COP31. And we seek to encourage open discussion and transparent discussion within civil society and academia in the lead up to the conference in order to contribute to a successful outcome in Antalya this November. And this webinar series is designed with that purpose in mind. So today's session will focus on what we know so far about COP31 because this is the first webinar in this series, then the next ones will come in the next months. And so we will focus on what we know, including the structure of the presidency, vision of the COP presidency and approach, and the draft action agenda and other emerging priorities. And we will also reflect on possible agenda items in the negotiations and on broader expectations from COP31, especially from the civil society. So today we have three distinguished speakers with us, and I'd like to introduce them briefly first. Cosima Cassel is program lead for climate diplomacy and geopolitics at E3G, a climate change think tank with offices in London, Brussels, Berlin, and Washington, D.C. Cosima is joining us from Berlin today. Welcome, Cosima. Andreas Sieber is head of political strategy at 350.org, an international organization addressing the climate crisis based in the Netherlands with a global network of offices. Andreas is joining us from Amsterdam. Welcome, Andreas. And Bengisu Özenç is director of the Sustainable Economics and Finance Association, SEFIA, based in Ankara. Bengisu is also representing the Climate Network today, which is a coalition of civil society organizations in Turkey working collaboratively on climate crisis. Welcome, Bengisu. So today we are connecting from 4 different cities, so it's a real international meeting today. Before giving the floor to our speakers today, I'd like to start with the latest developments in Turkey's preparations for COP31. I will briefly outline what has happened so far, who is involved, and what Turkey is aiming to achieve at COP31. So my presentation will be quite descriptive. So what do we know so far? And then I'll give the floor to our speakers. So let me share my screen. Okay. As you know, COP31 will be held in Antalya from 9 to 20 of November this year. And the incoming COP31 presidency in Australia will work in close partnership in line with the Turkey-Australia partnership modalities. This sentence I took directly from the UNFCCC website. And I'd like to start with this Turkish-Australian partnership modalities because I know that it's a very interesting part of this year's COP. So what this partnership agreement says, so it says Turkey will host COP31, including the World Leaders Summit in Turkey. A representative of Turkey will be nominated to be elected as president. And COP31 president assigns a representative of Australia as the president of negotiations as the vice president of the COP for the duration of COP31. And the host will be in Turkey, but the pre-COP will be hosted in a Pacific island country This is written in the agreement, but today we know that it's going to be in Fiji. And leaders meeting during the pre-COP or before the pre-COP will be in Tuvalu. And these meetings will be supported by the government of Australia. According to the agreement, Turkey, as COP31 president, will prepare communications on the COP31 conference, appoint at UN high level climate champion, appoint the youth champion, but the youth champion will be proposed by Australia. And Turkey will be responsible for COP31 action agenda. And that's why actually today we will talk a lot about action agenda, because Turkey already started preparations about that. And in the agreement regarding Australia, it is said that, and this is important, a representative of Australia as the president of negotiations will be taking forward all mandates arising from negotiated outcomes, convening consultations, meetings, etc., taking forward communications in relation to the negotiations, select ministerial and other co-facilitators for negotiations. And that's also important. Australia will be leading the negotiations agenda at COP31, including production of draft texts, and will be the focal point for engagements with the UNFCCC with regard to negotiations. So this collaboration is important. And also, this last sentence is important in terms of who is going to mandate. And it says Turkey and Australia, while taking leadership as COP31 president and president of negotiations, respectively, will consult each other. If there's a difference of views between Turkey and Australia, consultations will take place until the differences resolved to mutual satisfaction, which can be forever, but it's a very interesting rule that we can discuss maybe during this meeting. So what happened so far? I'm going to share major developments so far. Just after we came back from Belém, so in December, Turkish ministry took the first online meeting with Australia. And then just before the new year, Minister of Environment, Urbanization and Climate Change of Turkey, Murat Kurum, was appointed as COP31 president designate. And in early January, first Turkish-Australian meeting in Ankara was held, but not in the ministerial level, in the deputy ministerial level. In 21st of January, first Turkish UNFCCC meeting was held in Antalya. And just after this meeting, Samet Ağırbaş was appointed as the high-level champion. I will introduce him in the next slides. And 4th of January, Murat Kurum and the COP president, Murat Kurum, and Chris Bowen, who is the Minister of Climate Change and Energy of Australia and will probably be the president of negotiations, had at their first online meeting. And in February, 11th and 12th of February, COP31 was launched in Istanbul with a large attendance from UNFCCC. The Simon Steele was there, UNFCCC Secretary, COP30 President Dolago from Brazil was there, and teams from Australia and Azerbaijan was there. But Chris Bowen didn't show up in this first launch meeting. And then 26th of February, there was a very large meeting in Ankara with a consultation meeting with civil society and academia with hundreds of participants. It was important. And also, just a couple of days ago, 12th of March, Murat Kurum and IEA, International Energy Agency Chief Fatih Birol had a press conference in Istanbul. So in this last three meetings, COP President Murat Kurum addressed to civil society and to the press. So most of the information we have other than the written statements, are collected from these meetings. So very briefly, I'd like to show you the organizational scheme. Under COP president, there is this president of negotiations, there is a COP31 presidency office, high-level champion, etc. But there is also a steering committee, there is also an international advisory board and the consultation board. So we don't exactly know the content of the international advisory board and consultation yet, but I'll tell you about the structure of the steering committee. But also, there is also a more executive organizational part with all these managers, diplomacy manager, etc. But I'd like to show you in detail about this executive part. Under the executive director, other than venue planning, there is one climate diplomacy officer. And under the climate diplomacy officer, there are three responsible persons about Turkish negotiations, COP31 action agenda, and the pavilion and event planning. But there is also a part about a section or department about thematic champions. Other than high-level champion, there will be three thematic champions, as we see from here, that the resilient cities champion, green finance champion, and the green technology champion. So we don't know their names yet, but this is the structure. And in the steering committee, other than the COP31 president, there are three of four deputy ministers here about planning, operations, and construction, and director of climate change here, and other all relevant ministries and public institutions, also Antalya governorship, Antalya metropolitan municipality, etc., are in the steering committee. Now, just to show you the most significant persons here in this list, Murat Kurum is the COP31 president designate. He is the Minister of Environment, Urbanization, and Climate Change. But most importantly, just look at the name of the ministry. So ministry is not only about environment and climate change, but also about urbanization. And Murat Kurum is the minister since 2018 with only 1 year gap. But he is mainly coming from civil engineering background. He is mostly in his professional life, he worked in urbanization sector. So his most strongest suit is about urbanization, but now he is also becoming the co-president, and it's an important step. Fatma Varank, one of the four deputy ministers, and most of the environmental and climate change departments is under her mandate, and she is also a climate change negotiator. She has an important role in the COP negotiations. Halil Hasar is the director of climate change. There is a directorate of climate change under the ministry, which is stronger than a normal department. It's a more, not autonomous, but it's a more stronger, let's say, institution under the ministry. And Ali Lassar is originally a professor of environmental engineering, and he has been the director of climate change in the last 3 years. And Samet Ağırbaş, who is appointed as high-level champion by Murat Kurum, is the chairman of the board of the Zero Waste Foundation. And Zero Waste, as you know, is one of the environmental flagship campaigns of the Turkish government and is going to be a top agenda in the action agenda. Then Bengisu will talk about it. So, and what do we know about Turkey's vision for COP31 so far? So I collected these things from mostly from the press conferences and COP presidents' talks. The main theme of the slogan maybe of the conference is announced as the COP of the future, but also they call it as an implementation COP, as a continuity of the Belém COP30. There are some important statements about some issues. The first one is about 1.5 degree target. Murat Kurum is saying that they aim On the one hand, to maintain political momentum in line with the 1.5 degrees target, and on the other hand, to accelerate the transition to implementation. So implementation is always emphasized, but 1.5 target is also emphasized many times. That's an important point. Another interesting thing, he said this in the consultation meeting. He defined Turkey as a balancing power between the fossil bloc and the green bloc. He didn't define fossil bloc and green bloc, but this is an interesting statement. And he said Turkey is a non-aligned position. So Turkey is between developed and developing world, between North and South. So Turkey is defined as kind of a mediator between these, let's say, polarized blocs. His statement is mostly from the CBDR perspective, as you see from here. Climate justice is also mentioned, but he's saying that they are not representing one of them. Also, they always say that Turkey is using peace diplomacy experience for climate diplomacy, reflecting mediation experience from the Ukraine war, from Gaza efforts, etc., into climate negotiations. And also, they emphasize a lot about building trust and consensus. And they say, I find this statement quite ambitious. COP31 will be a turning point in climate action as an implementation COP. And I want to quote three important answers given by Murat Kurum, COP president, as a response to journalists' questions. One is about US withdrawal from the Paris Agreement, and he said emissions do not have passports, and the withdrawal of one country is not important for the process. Another interesting answer was about a question of one journalist about the co-presidency with Australia. The journalist asked as a co-presidency, and he said Turkey is the co-president and there is no co-presidency. Australia has to conduct all consultations related to negotiation matters in coordination with the co-presidency. In other words, Australia cannot take a decision that has not been endorsed by the co-presidency, and there is no such problem between us. We are carrying out this work in full alignment. So this was a quite direct answer. That's why I like to quote this. And last but not least, the response to the tough agenda. I think this is also quite promising at this stage. He said decisions on a roadmap for transitioning away from fossil fuels have already been taken at previous conferences. Building on these decisions, we will hopefully take further steps to strengthen them. So this is also an important discussion, as you know. So they summarize their vision in these three matters: dialogue, consensus, and action. I already talked about that. But they also, especially in the last press conference with Fatih Birol, IEA chair, they emphasized their energy vision in COP31. And interestingly, the most important focus here is energy security and accessible and affordable energy systems. It's an interesting point, I guess, especially during this war, and energy became again a very important geopolitical issue, etc., but also accelerating the clean energy transition in line with climate goals is among the three visions. And this is the last slide. In that specific meeting, they also announced their energy priorities for COP31. First one is clean energy transition. Second is zero waste and methane reduction. Interestingly, methane reduction became a very important priority in this COP. Climate resilient cities is an important point. As I already told you, Murat Kurum is coming from urbanization background, so most probably this is one of the reasons why urbanization, building energy efficiency, etc., are on the energy agenda. Climate action implementation mechanism is one of them, and green industrialization. All of them are actually in the action agenda. So Bengisu will also touch upon them. So this is my introduction to Turkey's position so far, as we know, so we can discuss on this background. Now I'd like to give the floor to Bengisu. So she will talk about what we already know regarding the action agenda, as well as the presidency's approach to civil society engagement and participation. And she will also share the expectations of the climate network in Turkey. By the way, for the audience, you can always ask your questions by Q&A section. Please, whenever you want, you can write. So Bengisu, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ümit. Thank you very much for the invitation and for the opening speech. Actually, it was very informative. And I think this is a great opportunity actually to share our perspective as the climate NGOs and how the space in the action agenda is evolving in Turkey. And it's an early initiative, I believe, but it is vital as this is an extraordinary year where we must not consider only the priorities of COP presidency of one country, but we have to, seek for the coordination between Turkey and Australia team. So thank you very much for taking this initiative. And let me first start with briefly introducing Sefia. Sefia is a research-oriented NGO based in Ankara, conducting economic and financial analysis to support just energy transitions in particular and ambitious climate policies in general. As you mentioned, Sefia is also among the founding partners of Climate Network of Turkey, which was launched just over a year ago as a coalition of 16 NGOs with the objective of contributing to the development of science-based, actionable national climate targets and policies that are in line with 1.5 degrees Celsius goal. As Sefia and Climate Network, we have supported Turkey's bid for COP31 since the very beginning, believing that such presidency presents a significant opportunity for Turkey to move beyond its current climate policies and demonstrate a genuine will for transformation. However, for this opportunity to be realized, obviously there are certain conditions to be met. The COP31 presidency also represents an opportunity for the climate NGOs in Turkey. It's an opportunity to become more visible, influential, and have a greater say in both national and international climate policies. And in this regard, we aim to utilize our activities to seize these opportunities and build a more permanent agenda, an agenda moving beyond COP31 at the national level. So how we engage with the COP presidency? So it is quite difficult to say that climate policies in Turkey, as with any other policy area, are developed through inclusive participatory process. Yes, we maintain a positive dialogue with ministries at the technical level on certain topics and engage in mutual conversation. But there's an absence of civil society organizations in formal decision-making mechanisms, and it stands out as a significant deficiency. And so when you were mentioning about the steering committee, there was a block which mentioned about the Climate Change and Adaptation Coordination Board. This is the highest level coordination body of climate policy in Turkey. But what we see looking at the formulation of this coordination body, we see that civil society organizations who are expert in the climate fields are excluded. But whereas business organizations are represented alongside with relevant ministries. So this kind of a government structure where civil society and affected communities and independent expertise are systematically sidelined in shaping the climate policies. And this kind of a deficiency actually weakens the legitimacy, quality, and social ownership of these policies. And we, actually faced this risk materializing in the form of significant resistance during the climate law negotiations last year. Such lack of representation is also carried over to COP31 governance. As I mentioned, so within the steering committee for the COP31, the official representation of the non-state actors remains limited to the members of the coordination board, where the civil society is absent. As you also mentioned about the consultation meeting that was held in February 26th. So it was the only structured consultation process of the COP presidency with the NGOs, and there were over 400 participants from NGOs and academia. But this was more of a launch of the COP31 presidency for the NGO and academia bubble rather than a structured consultation. Where the presidency structure, the vision, and action agenda priorities were presented. So I will move on to the action agenda priorities, but let me first mention one thing about the capacity of the Turkish NGOs. So this consultation meeting actually showed us that among the 400 participants, the number of individuals capable of contributing to the COP discussions at an international level from the climate negotiations perspective is quite limited. So it was quite surprising to see that most of the people and organizations who could provide meaningful contributions were among us, among the climate NGOs and think tank community in the climate space. And I mean, we as the climate NGOs have the experience, data, and knowledge accumulated so far, and our strong connections with the international networks play a significant role in our contribution to the international and national discussion. So for this reason, it is important for the Turkish NGOs to continue receiving necessary support that will strengthen our position in the climate policy space in Turkey. So coming back to the action agenda, I will start sharing my screen. Yes, okay. So actually, before the consultation meeting, you can see my screen, right? It's clear. So about 2 weeks before the meeting, the consultation meeting, we come across a document circulating through informal channels.
Bengisu, sorry.
Yes.
Bengisu, sorry. There is one. Yes. Can you click this? Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Sorry. Okay. Here it is. So in the previous draft action agenda, we saw that there were 14 priorities listed under action agenda. And during the consultation meeting, we observed that these priorities have been reduced to 9. And recently we received another draft with a slightly different categorization. So the action agenda is still evolving. So coming from 14 priorities to 9, so we see that there are some priorities which have been removed entirely, which are tourism and cultural heritage, mitigation technology is digitalization of climate action, sustainable transport systems. Climate finance was a standalone priority in the previous draft, but now we see that climate action implementation mechanism and climate resiliencies cover some of the items that were previously covered under climate finance. So we do not see the climate finance agenda as a priority standing on its own. So following all these changes, so here is the latest draft, actually. So we had the zero waste, yes, still standing as the first priority in the agenda. And there is a great effort from the from both the COP presidency and, as we heard from the Fatih Birol's speech during the joint press conference, for an effort to link this zero waste initiative to climate agenda through methane emissions. And now in the latest draft, we see that food waste is also listed under zero waste. So youth and education, it is there with the same scope. Food security, we see that it was also included in the early agenda, but food security bank is now removed from the list. Clean energy transition, unfortunately, we do not see a lot of emphasis on renewables. And in the latest draft, we see that energy efficiency and smart systems and digitalization is removed from the priorities, but clean cooking is now listed as one of the agenda items under clean energy transitions, and there was a emphasis on clean cooking during the press conference as well. Resilience, now it is newish kind of addition to the list, but it was prior to this draft, some of these items were listed under the climate resilient cities, and Rio Synergy is entered into the resilience bucket. So we have climate resilient cities. So in the latest draft, we see that there's a lot of emphasis on buildings. These are new. And locally led climate action and early warning systems are removed from the climate resilient cities bucket. So these are new things in the draft agenda. And seas and oceans, it was again primarily in the first draft, but now it also includes the blue economy. So I haven't touched upon the green industrialization and climate action implementation mechanism, but it is fair to say that Turkey's presidency is primarily focusing on green industrialization and climate action implementation mechanism. We can infer this both from the concrete mechanism proposals presented under the action agenda presentation that we received earlier, and from the previous engagements of the COP presidency to date. So under climate action implementation mechanism, the main objective is closing the implementation gap, and they have defined a 4-layered process. It starts with the building of technical and analytic backbone with analysis and modeling, followed by the project development stage, and third by the creation of matching mechanisms for mobilization of finance. And lastly, the last layer is for institutional and multilateral integration, which brings together relevant international organizations with the national key stakeholders. So there is a similar layering for the green industrialization priority. It starts with the analysis of the enabling framework, followed by the identification of key technology and system transformation initiatives, pathways, and these pathways and interventions are matched with necessary financing and investment to ensure a successful delivery ecosystem and achieve measurable progress. Maybe I'll come to the timeline. Here you can see that. I'll also try to see it. Yeah. So we concluded the national consultations with the ministries and institutions, including academia and NGOs. And now we are standing here just before they open the action agenda for international feedback. I don't know if it is possible to, call the consultation meeting of 400 people as a structured and official consultation mechanism, but we will be providing our inputs for the action agenda. And so they opened the international feedback process on April 1st. But at the same time, they say that the second draft will be also issued. On the 15th of May, they plan for the official announcement of the action agenda, and the launch of the action agenda will take place during Bonn sessions. So this is how the action agenda is looking right now. And maybe I'll touch upon some of the asks as the climate network of Turkey from the COP31 presidency. Of course, first and foremost, we expect a participatory and transparent governance approach, which shows a clear and decisive stand on phasing out of fossil fuels and places just transition and climate justice at the heart of negotiations. And this meaningful, continuous, structured civil society dialogue will also help COP31 process to take as a strong presidency. It will give a legitimacy of the process and impact the outcomes. Also, from the national perspective, we ask for the government to demonstrate a sincere global leadership by taking steps at the national policies and actions, such as offering a space for discussion of the phasing out of fossil fuels. So Turkey's current climate policies do not offer a holistic transformation perspective aligned with its own 2053 targets, actually. So when we look at the energy system, the continued dependence on the fossil fuels, especially coal, keeps emissions structurally high. So what we are experiencing is a rapid decline of the coal economy. And we demand the government a formal statement committing to no new coal, and also following it with a clear timetable and planning for the coal phase out. Just transition is also an inseparable part of the transformation. So as the climate network, just transition, we believe that just transition cannot be governed through ad hoc mechanisms. So it has to have a governance structure designed and implemented through policies, well-defined policies, and institutionalized mechanisms that are fundamentally linked to the coal phase-out plans. So I'll stop here, and maybe I'll come back with further questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Bengisu. It was very clear, both in terms of action agenda and the expectations from Climate Network. Next, I would like to give the floor to Cosima. So we already talked about action agenda, but there is also a negotiation agenda, which is, of course, more important. So she will speak about expectations for COP31 and possible agenda items, negotiation agenda items, including those that will be shaped by the Australian negotiation presidency. Cosima, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Ümit, and Bengisu for laying out the Turkish priorities, and thanks so much for the Istanbul Policy Center for pulling this webinar together. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'll just share my screen. So hopefully you can see my slides. Yeah, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everyone. Just to say, yeah, my name is Cosima Cassel. I'm the program lead for the multilateral venues team within the climate diplomacy and geopolitics team of E3G. If you haven't heard of E3G, as Ümit was saying, we're a kind of international independent think tank working towards a safe climate for all. In addition to our offices in Washington, Brussels, Berlin, and London, we also have a network of senior associates worldwide to kind of get the global context. We have expertise expertise in finance, in energy, in clean industry and trade, and also in climate diplomacy, which is the team that I sit in. And within my team, we kind of look at kind of the intersection between climate policy, foreign policy, geopolitics, and using kind of diplomacy to accelerate global climate action, particularly around major international processes such as COPs. So today I'll talk a bit through kind of the dynamics, priorities, and recommendations for the COP presidency. So I'll start off giving a kind of, look at the global context that we find ourselves in 2026. The presidency arrangements have already been excellently covered by Ümit, but we'll talk a little bit about what the agenda priorities are for COP31, and then look at kind of some recommendations that we have for the presidencies.
Cosima, sorry, can you click the hide in your screen? Yeah, thank you.
Okay, great. So COP31 in the global context. So just to kind of lay out where we are in the world in 2026, I'm sure you're all aware of the current geopolitical situation we find ourselves in, a very unprecedented world, what Simon Steele called the New World Disorder in a recent speech. And this is kind of really reshaping the kind of dynamics that we're seeing within COPs, but also in the wider multilateral space. We're seeing kind of a rise of kind of multipolarity, rise of new diplomatic alliances, and things are changing. So we're living in this world of uncertainty at the moment. Security concerns are obviously taking political bandwidth away from climate action. We're seeing escalating conflicts, not least the conflicts in the Middle East at the moment. And this also kind of shows to demonstrate kind of the risks of overdependence on fossil fuels within the global system. It's becoming more and more clear that a pivot towards energy security and resilience is critical. But there is, huge challenges amidst kind of disinformation, amidst a backlash against climate policies in a number of different geographies. On the other hand, we're seeing a huge investment in clean energy and tech. So clean investment actually climbed from roughly $200 billion a year a decade ago to over $2 trillion in 2025. And it's outpacing fossil fuel investment by more than 2 to 1. So we're really seeing that kind of momentum in the real world. However, there's growing kind of debt, loss and damage from climate impacts, and these are also growing. And climate was estimated to have caused around $224 billion in global economic damages last year. And this will only increase. And this kind of underscores the urgent need to reduce emissions, to build resilience, and to take immediate action. We're seeing a lot of developed countries cutting their official development aid, given the number of crises they're facing. There's huge fiscal constraints, huge worries about the economy, and this is kind of leaving developed countries uncertain on how they're going to deliver their existing commitments, and has kind of also contributed to some of the tensions that we've seen in COPs on the finance space as well. Coming out of COP30, so there was an agreement reached at COP30, and this shows that the multilateral system does still work and does still deliver, but it's severely limited. It's not delivering at the pace that we need it to, but countries are showing up and are engaging. There were some positive hooks in the text, for example, around a global implementation accelerator, a Belém mission to 1.5 degrees C as well, which still need to be developed, but there is hooks there that are for developing this year. There was establishment of a just transition mechanism as well, something else that needs to be operationalized and built on this year, and an agreement on tripling adaptation finance. However, there were kind of, objections around the global goal for adaptation and the indicators, which requires more work. Loss and damage did not get the kind of recognition and elevation that it needed either. The transitioning away from fossil fuels roadmap also gained momentum, but there was divisions in parties, and there was no explicit mention of fossil fuels in the text coming out of COP30. Trade was a major focus, and now is informally incorporated into the COP agenda. And as I said before, we're seeing these new kind of geopolitical dynamics emerging and shaping the outcomes, not least kind of the alignment and the strength of BRICS as a group, and the kind of challenges for the EU to push ambitious outcomes without, a kind of constructive US at the table as well. So I just want to show this timeline to just kind of frame COP31 in the context of the longer term picture. So we are seeing COP31 as a really kind of critical building block on the route to COP33, which is when the second global stocktake will take place. And this will be a kind of key moment to, kind of to show whether the world is delivering and whether we have course corrected. So we need to start planning for that now, using all these diplomatic moments on the way. I mean, this is just a handful, there's more, but just to show, this, we need to kind of have that steady drumbeat across different moments from now until then, and really kind of put the building blocks in place to deliver on the global stocktake too. And COP31 should be seen within that wider long-term picture. So moving on to kind of presidency arrangements and COP agenda. So this slide just kind of highlights, the important role that not just Turkey and Australia play in this COP, but actually a number of other players. We have Turkey, leading COP. We have Australia's presidency of negotiations, but also this year, the Pacific islands will play a key role. The pre-COP will be held in Fiji, and there's going to be a day trip to Tuvalu, and this is kind of, that their priorities must be kind of incorporated into that overarching COP31 agenda. We're also seeing Brazil continuing to be very active, especially on driving forward some of its outcomes on implementation and the future of the action agenda as well. So hopefully working very closely with Turkey on that. But we also need to kind of look ahead to COP32 next year in Ethiopia, and the COP33, as I mentioned, with the global stocktake 2 taking place in that year. And it's really a role for Turkey and Australia to work very closely with all these countries to kind of ensure that there is continuity across the presidencies, ensure there is buy-in from past and future presidencies to really get the most impact out of the climate regime and the COP process. So I won't talk too much to this slide because it's already been excellently articulated by Ümit, but just to highlight kind of the different roles and also, the activity of Brazil as well. And also, even though Turkey leads the action agenda, it's also for the other presidency countries or those involved in the presidency to work together and build on that COP30 legacy from last year. Just a word on the pre-COP, as already mentioned, this is going to be held in the Pacific with a focus on leader level attendance. So this is kind of elevated a little bit more than previous pre-COPs, and really kind of is a really important opportunity to bring attention to the particular needs and priorities of small island states. So there's going to be a 3-stage approach. So in September, Palau will host the Pacific Islands Forum, and this will also include a kind of Leaders Ascent event on climate. Then Fiji will host the pre-COP in October, with Tuvalu having a kind of Leaders segment event alongside that as well. Some priorities for the Pacific include accelerating finance and investment, particularly around increasing pledges and having this as a really key pledging moment for the Pacific Resilience Fund, really shining a light on the resilience challenges which such islands face, also on loss and damage and oceans, and the importance of those agendas and their priorities there. The energy transition will also feature with a push for kind of 100% renewables in the Pacific, and also action on the transitioning away from fossil fuels roadmap, which Andreas will speak to a bit later. So this slide, I'm not going to talk through in lots of detail because there's a lot in here, and this is also not comprehensive, but this just kind of lays out a number of the different agenda items that are on the table for this COP. So this COP is not like, for example, COP29, where there was a key focus on the finance agenda. In the negotiations, there were a lot of different negotiated items or mandated items to pick up on through this year. I've mentioned some of the kind of cross-cutting issues, like setting the agenda on the global stocktake, picking up on some of the new initiatives that are working through. But also there's negotiated items to kind of carry forward on just transition, continuation of the mitigation work program, finance. Every COP is a finance COP nowadays, and this will be a very critical segment of where we need to kind of pick up some of the momentum and have those kind of constructive dialogues on how climate finance can be aligned with the clean energy transition. Also kind of building confidence that the NCQG will be delivered, and the roadmap, the Baku-Berlin roadmap, will be operationalized as well. Adaptation and resilience will also be very important. So Australia has a kind of key job to resolve some of the methodological disagreements that came out of COP30, but also kind of elevate, action delivering on the national adaptation plans, ensuring that there are the kind of means to deliver them, and building the adaptation architecture to support delivery on adaptation. Also, as I mentioned, trade will be a topic this year. Trade dialogues are mandated now, so kind of Australia will, as presidency of the negotiations, will need to lead through that process and ensuring that trade tensions are diffused and the barriers to kind of green trade are overcome. So just kind of to summarize some of those points, I won't go over this again, but these are kind of the main priorities that we see, which Australia will play a really key role in driving forward. But also, the other presidency, like especially Turkey, needs to be kind of supportive and building on these as well to make sure that we can deliver across the piece on finance, on adaptation, on trade, on just transition, and on mitigation. And of course, on implementation, which is a key topic. And just one thing I forgot to say on this slide, coming back, is COPs nowadays, negotiations will remain very important, and all these issues need to be addressed. But COPs are kind of arriving to be a new kind of structure of two tiers, and this is why we have tier 1 and tier 2 here, and the elevation of the action agenda of some of these coalitions of the willing that are being built around different topics. That's going to be incredibly important, that we're seeing that progress within those areas alongside the negotiations. So the COPs really do become a kind of two-tier regime. So moving on to presidency recommendations. So yeah, as we've talked about, we have a very unique kind of presidency model this year, and I think it's critical for all countries involved to really focus on ensuring there's continuity and coherence. So working really closely together, not only with each other, but also, as I said, with the past and future presidencies, as it's really critical that we make this kind of continuous political and technical process up until the second global stocktake. This will only work if all countries are bought in, all countries are consulted, and most of all that Australia and Turkey are collaborating very closely here. Action agenda needs to be strengthened, as I mentioned. Having that kind of second tier, identifying champions to drive some of that as well is going to be critical. And closing the ambition gap across adaptation as well, but across mitigation. So making sure that the system is fit to deliver and is, course correcting the trajectory that we're heading in. Recommendations for Turkey specifically, demonstrating that domestic leadership is going to be important, building on its own NDC and showcasing progress. Acting as a geopolitical bridge between the kind of East and West developing countries, it has a unique position to be able to do that and to foster this inclusive dialogue and mediate between some of the different players here. And then, of course, continuing the operationalization of the era of implementation via the action agenda. For Australia, it's going to be critical that they work very closely, hand in hand with the Pacific, to make sure that those priorities are highlighted, particularly around ocean stewardship, indigenous knowledge, and the transition away from fossil fuels. This is also kind of requires them to be engaging very closely in the build-up to the pre-COP, making sure that that is a success. Driving negotiation ambition, obviously, is critical in their role. And, this will not be easy, as we've talked about some of the issues on consensus and the difficult geopolitical background that they're acting in the midst of, but really kind of driving meaningful outcomes on adaptation finance, loss and damage, global energy transition. Showcasing transition solutions. So again, showcasing their own domestic ambition, but also what they're doing within Asia as a key region for the decarbonisation pathways. Finally, the recommendations for the Pacific Islands, who are leading the pre-COP, like really kind of using this as a key moment where the spotlight is on the Pacific Islands to showcase what the region is facing in terms of frontline challenges, and also some of the innovative solutions that are happening in the region. Finance will be a key one as well, so making sure that there is kind of high-profile pledges to the Pacific Resilience Facility, and then maintaining this pressure to keep 1.5 degrees C within reach. Like this should never, we should never lose sight that this is the goal, right? To keep temperature warming under the 1.5 degree limit. If there is overshoot, then bringing it under that limit as soon as possible, and limiting that overshoot as much as possible will be critical. And I think the Pacific Islands, who have been very active talking about this, is a real opportunity to make sure that we don't lose sight of that goal. So I'll stop there. Thanks so much. And I'll pass back to Ümit.
Thank you, Cosima. It was a great review of the agenda items and the expectations. Now, finally, I'd like to give the floor to Andreas, and he will address the transitioning away from fossil fuels agenda, what we might expect to hear about this potential agenda item from the presidency, other parties, and civil society, and possible COP outcomes related to a fossil fuel roadmap. Andreas, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Ümit. Hi, everybody. Andreas with 350.org. Been really interesting to listen to all the previous speakers, and I'm just going to focus on one aspect at the COP, the energy transition, namely the transition away from fossil fuels to renewables. Two remarks up front. One, I will focus on what is happening within the COP and then the kind of what we've seen at the last COP in Belém at COP30. But I think we should just be aware how much this happens right now within the context of geopolitics, the war in the Gulf, in Iran, and besides people suffering in that region, energy prices across the world have skyrocketed. And these bills land on kitchen tables while fossil fuel companies stand to make windfall profits. And I think a lot of this will contextualize the discussions going forward in this year. We don't know how long this will go on. We haven't been given clear signals, to say the least, what's the plan, what we can expect in the coming weeks. But I think it's becoming clearer that this will not be resolved immediately. And just as we have many folks from Turkey on the call, one prediction, for instance, has been like for every 10% increase in the oil price, overall inflation. So not only the cost of fossil fuels and things directly related to that, from fertilizers to filling your tank, but like overall inflation rises by about 1%. So 10% in oil price rise results in about 1% in inflation. So really quite dramatic impacts that are felt around the world, in Europe, in Asia, where countries also have less of reserves to buffer against less imports from fossil fuels. So this has clearly shown us the fragility of the fossil fuel system. The second point I'd like to make is this is a tough conversation. Equity is at the center of this, right? Wealthy nations have used up much of the carbon space. Finance plays a critical role, but it's also very, very political. So whenever we talk about this issue going into a COP, we're up for a tough fight, and we need to fight this fight, as depending on your methodology, between 68% to 75% of the climate crisis are driven by burning fossil fuels. So you could say, to some extent, phasing out fossil fuels is not everything, but without phasing out fossil fuels, everything else is kind of nothing. So we need to do this, and of course we need the finance for it, and we need the mechanisms for it. And we need to do it in a just way. So let's get into it. We entered the last COP, and I give a bit of background of how we got here, because I think that helps us understand the context for COP31 a bit better. We entered COP30 after loads of countries handed in their so-called new nationally determined contributions, right? So every country under the Paris Agreement is supposed to submit a climate target every 5 years. And this is the overview of the World Resource Institute of how much emission reduction that achieves what you see here, the 2.5 gigaton reduction. And you see that pathway compared to what's necessary for 2 or even 1.5 degrees limits. So clearly there has been a massive shortfall, and fossil fuels are obviously at the center of this shortfall. On the positive side, we see renewables breaking records. We see that emissions are projected to peak. They have structurally peaked in key countries like China, but progress has been far too slow. So the big question that was asked to COP30 is, what do you do in response to that, right? This is unacceptable. And just one explanation, unconditional means the part that is what countries commit to do anyway. And then there is conditional things they would do. So many developing countries would say, we can do more if there is finance, if there's technical support, and so on and so forth. But I think it's safer to take the unconditional one as the baseline, and not to say that the conditional part gets us significantly closer to 1.5 degrees. So actually, Cosima's colleagues at E3D did a great job in tracking all these country targets, and here you see basically how they did on the energy transition. So overall, we see some progress really on more sectoral targets, in particular also energy targets in the new round of that we saw coming in. And this is good news, right? Like, this helps countries plan, but we see that those plans are largely focused on renewable deployment. And then when you look at no new coal plants, and in particular kind of facing down oil and gas and looking at production, those targets are very weak and light, to say the least. So we entered COP with this shortfall in ambition, and from our observation, the kind of two areas where its shortfall was the starkest was deforestation and transitioning away from fossil fuels. So clearly that is where we needed to make progress. And here's just a few pictures summarizing the story of COP30. Of course, much more happened, but we saw at the Leaders Summit that happened before COP30, President Lula speaking up for and bringing this idea of roadmaps to halt deforestation and transition away from fossil fuels. And there's been a few ideas floating around, like how do we plan for this? But I think he kind of pinned it down to, yes, roadmaps. That's our vehicle, right? Like we plan for this, and we see how we get there. What are the barriers? And we'll develop this process hopefully. So he mentioned that, and we literally had one country. So that is where you see in the chart below, and the rising momentum during COP. We literally had kind of one country at that moment supporting this idea. And then within a matter of days, a bunch of other countries came in behind, and their civil society, and this is, I think, where we see also the value add. We pushed a lot of countries to like, look, we have an opening here to make progress on this massive shortfall to transition away from fossil fuels, get behind this. So we saw countries getting behind that. For instance, the Environmental Integrity Group, consisting of, for instance, Switzerland, Mexico, and South Korea got behind this the first. Then the Alliance of Latin American Countries, ILAC, consisting of countries such as Costa Rica and Chile, got behind this. And then others joined in, individual countries from the UK to Germany, to Denmark, to the Alliance of Small Island States. And over time, we really saw growing momentum. And then in week 2, there was a press conference with ministers. You see here the Guardian article. You see the UK next to the Marshall Islands minister saying, yes, we want a roadmap. Over 80 countries now want this. What is the presidency doing? I should say, there was a counter narrative that 80 countries want such a roadmap and 80 countries don't want it. That was completely false. It is a reality that there was a small group of countries who were concerned by that idea. Fair enough. But basically, I would say that was a bit of shenanigans that were being played, because like the 80 countries that were against the roadmap, that were simply countries who haven't taken a position yet. Most of these countries were either friendly towards the roadmap, or neutral, and usually based in a country group in which they coordinated, where there was one or two countries who were not in favor of the roadmap. So clearly that there was strong momentum, and I think the large majority of countries realize that it makes sense to plan, right? Like to plan ahead what is needed, what are the barriers, how to address these barriers, what is the scientific limits within we have to implement our transitioning away from fossil fuels. And then in the end, we had the announcement that there will be a presidency initiative for a roadmap to transition away from fossil fuels. Now, you might say that's a bit ambiguous, and I think there's a few open questions still. But we know now that the Brazilians will consult with countries, with think tanks, with civil society, and that they will present a roadmap to transition away from fossil fuels with things like milestones and present it by October. And a lot of what we do with that, I think, then tables the fight or the challenge for COP31, and that is what ultimately also the Turkish presidency and their Pacific and Australian co-presidency partners have to deal with. So if we look at the menu for COP31, there's a bunch of things we could look at, and this is not necessarily a comprehensive list, but there's the mitigation work program. This officially ends in 2026. Yeah, and it has not been the most constructive space, is probably an understatement. And so there's a bit of a question if this is a dead horse and how worth it is to really pushing things there. I think personally we should, we should take all options we have, but there's also a real question like how much can actually be achieved. There is the Just Transition Work Program, and one of the victories of COP30, and also thanks to civil society, to organizations and networks such as Climate Action Network International, it was decided to establish a Just Transition Mechanism, also known as BAM, an acronym that still works, by the way, as the Belém Antalya mechanism. So keep using it, and really having a mechanism that supports countries to plan the transition a fair way, with the understanding that only if it is a just transition that works for the whole of society, we can expect to implement it at the speed needed. That thinking behind this mechanism, I think, is really valuable and will contribute to the implementation and will help getting us closer to the goals of the Paris Agreement. It is, I should say here that the mechanism is not only about energy, not even about mitigation only, but the whole of transitions that societies are meant to go through. Cosima already spoke to the Global Implementation Accelerator, so I'll be a bit more lean on that. And then we have the tough roadmap. And there really is the question, right? Like what we will do with it. There's a question if it will end up in the formal agenda. So it could be under an agenda item that is negotiated at COP, or countries could suggest that it's enough theoretically that one country requests an agenda item on it, or something like the action agenda, or some kind of other initiative taking things forward. I think overall, it's clear that we need to take this forward. This is too important to ignore, and we will rely on the leadership, and we will need to demand the leadership and the diplomatic creativity of the Australians, the Pacific, and the Turkish diplomats. One way to think about it is to say we will have a global roadmap this year. Could it make sense to, for instance, invite countries to do domestic roadmaps, following up from COP31, to plan their transition, to have these conversations, to as President Lula said it, to face their contradictions between what their policy does and what the science requires, and often actually also what market predictions tell you. If fossil fuels are about to peak, then your revenues might just go down. It's something you have to deal with as a country. It's not only about the climate, it's also about a healthy economy and moving towards a future safe economy. One last thought on the roadmap could be there should probably be a few countries that already do domestic roadmaps this year. We have heard from a bunch of countries that are thinking about it. The Brazilians, for one. Colombia might be another candidate. Netherlands, the co-hosts of the Santa Marta conference, might be another one. There might be a few more. And a country like Turkey as the COP president, I think very well should be asked to also come forward with a roadmap to transition away from fossil fuels. Finally, outcomes at COP rarely happen siloed, especially if they are that political. So linkages to other issues, namely adaptation and finance, will be quite critical. And it is one thing to ask a country to fight what they want to fight for. For instance, I think it is fair to say the Europeans have positioned themselves often as champions of mitigation, while not leaning into the necessary progress on adaptation and finance anywhere near enough. So it is one thing to say you fight for something, but it's another and maybe even more important question what you're ready to give up on from your own position. So I think if we look in particular at the European Union here, them leaning more into the finance and the adaptation will be key to unlock progress. And then just a final slide on the way forward, right? So we will have this conference in Santa Marta, where we hopefully have a bunch of countries being able to move things forward on a treaty to transition away from on a treaty to phase out fossil fuels. But also there will be a bunch of countries that maybe form some kind of second tier to that, right? So would those coalitions of the willing, what are they doing? They should probably make progress on the roadmap and on the broader conversation of transitioning away from fossil fuels. You will have the ministerials in Petersburg, Germany. So it's called the Petersburg Dialogue. It's not in St. Petersburg. And in Copenhagen in April and May, when ministers come together and pre-shape the agenda, right? That will be key kind of inside track intervention points. You then have the pre-negotiations in Bonn this year in June, which I think we should expect to table more information on the roadmap. So we hear the plan from the Brazilians is to give some indication there, and questions about the agenda at COP are very often pre-discussed and sometimes predetermined in Bonn. And then we have the pre-COP, obviously, in the Pacific, which will play a key role. And finally, COP31. And then I think that the key question, how we should think about the transition away from fossil fuels, is how we carry that forward from there to domestic governments, as well then as also Cosima pointed to COP33, which is the next global stocktake. Thanks very much, and back to you, Ümit.
Thank you, Andreas. It was really great presentation. So thank you all for your contributions. So we have 15 minutes to go. So I'd like to ask one extra question to each of you, and then we can also take questions from the audience. But please, shorter answers for in this round. So I'll start with Bengisu again. You already talked about what Climate Network thinks about Turkey's, or what kind of demands Climate Network is taking to the stage. And in terms of COP presidency, in terms of Turkey's role as president, what priorities would you like to see the Turkish presidency advance on the COP agenda? And more broadly, what are your expectations from the Turkey in its role as COP president.
Yes, Ümit, thank you very much. When I was talking about the expectations of the climate network, I was focusing on the national agenda, so such as the no new coal announcement and coal phase out plan. But of course, there are natural extensions to these asks. And actually, when I was listening to Cosima and Andres, they already summed up our expectations from the Turkish presidency. So what we would like to see from the Turkish presidency is to advance on the global agenda of the transitioning away from fossil fuels, to bring it to the negotiations with a stronger position and ensuring that the phase out of fossil fuels is explicitly reflected once again in the cover decision. And when you were talking about the press conference, you also mentioned that President Murat Kurum, when answering one of the questions, he said that they will carry forward the decisions made in the previous term. So I think it is promising, and as the civil society, we will follow up on his statement and offer our support to the COP presidency in taking the necessary steps for fulfilling this leadership responsibilities. And I was talking about the just transition mechanism, and Andres also mentioned about this. This will become a Belem Antalya mechanism. So we are aware of Turkey's enthusiasm regarding the just transition agenda, by the way. We are already in dialogue with the COP presidency in coordination with the relevant international organizations. So this year, Turkey also plans to announce its national just transition strategy by the time of COP31. So this is the time where the global agenda is aligned with Turkey's national priorities. So we think that it will be a great opportunity to move forward with the Just Transition Work Program. And in preparation of this strategy, our primary expectation is a just transition framework fundamentally anchored in fossil fuel phase out rather than a diluted or fragmented approach that allows other transformation agendas to overshadow the core necessity to move out of fossil fuels. And as CEFIA, we will engage with the COP presidency and relevant ministries and private sector to make renewables more visible and highlight the Mediterranean region's potential and the strategic opportunities it presents for a climate-aligned transformation. Here, one topic is the TerMet initiative, which aims to establish 1 terawatt renewables capacity across the broader Mediterranean region by 2030. The TerMet initiative offers an important opportunity to realize the potential of Turkey's leading the region as a diplomatic force. So in line with the Turkey's priorities in the action agenda to leave a lasting legacy and positioning Turkey as a regional leader, I think there is a great opportunity to Turkey to lead such kind of an initiative in the region. Also, making the COP as the Mediterranean COP, taking the opportunity to lead this initiative. So yeah, this is all. Thank you.
Thank you, Bengisu. So I just turned to Cosima. So we already framed the picture, but where do you see the biggest risks of political blockage at COP31, and how might the presidency navigate these challenges?
Thanks, Ümit. Yeah, I mean, I think there's kind of probably 3 areas where we'll see political blockage. It's not any surprise that we've seen them in previous COPs as well. I mean, I think the first is around finance. And, so since COP29 and the agreement of the NCQG, the expectations from developing countries on finance and the actual delivery in the form of kind of grant-based finance is not matching up. So it's how that kind of question and how the narrative around the finance and how finance is demonstrated is being delivered will be key to kind of build the confidence among developing countries. The second area is around trade. We've seen, kind of a lot of countries kind of perceiving, for example, the EU Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism mechanism as protectionist or unfair. And this can also kind of, may also kind of play up as well. We've got dialogues now within mandated, as I mentioned. And so hopefully those dialogues can go some way to kind of shifting the narrative around trade as actually kind of a something that can help climate action. That climate action can help trade and cooperation in that space. The third one is around kind of mitigation ambition, which Andreas has spoken to, and kind of pressure for kind of stronger mitigation action, transition away from fossil fuels versus kind of concerns on development space and fairness of the transition. And there's a risk that without the kind of finance and the support, then this will also become an area of contention at COP31. I think the presidencies, some of these issues are very entrenched and it will be difficult to resolve, but I think the presidencies, can navigate this by, well, one, they need to work very closely. They need to bring the action agenda and the negotiation agenda closely aligned. I think the Brazilians last year have built this excellent structure amongst the kind of 5-year plan for the action agenda, which is aligned with the first global stock take, and kind of building on that and really showing that there are kind of signals of delivery around kind of finance pipelines, partnerships, sectoral deals, which are kind of providing that finance on the ground, providing that support, and kind of unblocking ambition across the piece, also in terms of trade cooperation and the energy transition. I think the presidencies need to kind of work to activate and encourage different coalitions of the willing. These might be different depending on the topic, but bringing together those key actors that are pushing for more ambition and supporting them to work better together. The roadmap process is one of these processes which is doing that, kind of bringing together who's ambitious and bringing, even if there is challenges, but getting those people, those countries and parties talking and figuring out a way to navigate some of these issues. It's also going to be very critical that they elevate diplomacy on the key issues, so on delivery on nationally determined contributions, on finance, etc., ensuring that leader level is also engaged, so kind of using Erdogan, using Albanese to highlight the kind of priorities of the Turkish and the Australian presidencies, and using the kind of full diplomatic calendar to do that. So, how are kind of leaders showing up at different moments, and ministers as well. We've mentioned a few with the Petersburg Climate Dialogue and the Copenhagen Climate Ministerial, Santa Marta will be important ones, but also at leader level in the Gs, in the BRICS. Kind of these will be kind of key signals to watch on how countries are showing up and engaging and elevating and talking to climate as a priority to really kind of push that momentum. Climate weeks will also be really important, not just the UNFCCC mandated ones, but the kind of grassroots ones such as London Climate Action Week, New York, I think there's one in Baku, Rio. There's a lot of different climate weeks, and these are moments where you can show what's actually happening on the ground. Like implementation is happening. This is enabling ambition elsewhere. Finance events, the World Bank and IMF spring meetings will be a key moment to show that there is the reforms taking place to kind of deliver that finance and making the most of the finance that's available, as well as also on action on partnerships as well. The UK is hosting a partnerships conference in May and kind of reframing how those partnerships work and how that they can deliver for countries around the world. Thanks.
Thank you, Cosima. Andreas, I have a question, but also a similar question was raised by one of our participants, so I'll merge them. So you already talked about your expectations in terms of TAF from the Turkish presidency. And I already told you that in the press conference, he quite mentioned this in a promising way. But at the same time, he also said in one of other questions that the fossil fuel agenda is one of the key priorities among roughly 80 agenda items. So it's not the only important one. So it's kind of maybe downplaying the fossil fuel agenda a little bit. And at the same time, as you said, there is a conference in Santa Marta and Turkish delegation will also be there. So how do you assess this position or this approach by the Turkish presidency? This is my question. And one of our participants, Urmi Goswami, is asking, and I'll read it. The COP30 presidency is preparing a roadmap for TAF. under its responsibility and not as part of the negotiated agenda. So taking this roadmap forward would be the responsibility of Türkiye COP31 presidency and not part of the mandate of the Australian presidency of negotiations. We saw in Belém how the roadmap took center stage, even though it was not on the agenda. It seems to the same situation again. So how will TAF be taken up at COP31 and what can we expect as an outcome of this issue?
Yeah, thanks. There was a lot in there. I would say with regards to the Turkish presidency, they have sent mixed signals, right? And that is very normal that at this stage, COP presidencies are somewhat non-committal. Because that's somewhat understandable, and that's just part of the usual game, I would say, that they don't want to overpromise something that is very far in the future. They are in listening mode in the first half of the year. However, their game usually is to downplay expectations, and our job is to raise expectations. Because if we fall into that trap of downplayed expectations, we'll never get anywhere near enough. So we had this from other presidencies before. I would say the fact that there is about 50 priorities in the action agenda, for instance, none of them heads-on tackles the energy transition, tells me that both we have to do maybe a bit of a job to demand for that to be to take more center stage and to be taken more seriously by the Turkish presidency, not only within the action agenda, but also more broadly. So I take that as an indication of prioritization. The number one prioritization was waste management, which makes about 4% of global emissions when you count in the methane and so on and so forth. And obviously tackling that is important. But that's just dwarfed by how much is caused by fossil fuels. So I think that is the case. That is what we need to make very clear, and what our job is in the coming. Wait, sorry, that's a spoiled head around here. And then the other point with regards to Santa Marta is that I think we should expect the presidency to not only show up there, but to also come prepared. And I think one indicator how serious they are could be, are they willing to prepare their own domestic roadmaps to transition away from fossil fuels? And if not, what else do they have to offer us? So that's the question I would ask here. And then finally, with regards to the question in the chat and the agenda item, I think that is maybe a bit up in the air, right? I think Anatoni, the CEO of COP30, the other day said something that along the lines that actually it can very well end up in the agenda, and we could expect something in Bonn in the preparatory negotiations for COP31 to shape up in that direction. So I would not take it as a given yet where this lands. And even if it doesn't, like whether it ends up in a presidency initiative, the action agenda, or the formal negotiations, the COP president always has a responsibility to deliver, right? And as you lined out very helpfully at the start, the Australians and the Turkish will need to be in agreement. So I think either way that the Turkish will maybe not the pen holder but the hammer holder in this situation, making the decision. So they clearly and they will steer the process. So clearly a responsibility to deliver an outcome that helpfully take things forward as lined out, right? Like from COP31 to COP33, and ideally also bring it to the domestic level. That responsibility will be with the Turkish presidency.
Thank you, Andreas. There's another question. Let me. Okay, I have lost it. Yes. So I think Bengisu already answered this, but maybe we can raise also here. So the question is to Bengisu or anyone who wants to contribute from Nur Antalya. So as we know, Belem Gender Action Plan has been adopted with added strength. We did not find this topic among action agenda priorities recommended by COP31 presidency, either in main or subheadings. This issue is very important. There is a great need to strengthen contracting parties' commitments to gender responsive climate action. And why don't we see any headings related to climate action that actually have a gender perspective? Can you give a brief comment on this?
Very briefly, because I haven't followed up this issue with the presidency. So in our earlier conversation, when we were talking about the just transition agenda, this came up, and the presidency told us that there is a conversation on having the gender perspective in the action agenda. But so it seems that it's not appearing in the priorities. But I haven't followed up. I'm sorry, I have very limited knowledge on this.
Thank you. Another question from Maurice Zakariat, and he asks, do you think the issues of the social distribution effects of the transformation and just transition are not adequately addressed on the agenda priorities, or do these issues fall under one of the broader topics since they seem to be one of the main challenges in the actual implementation of climate policy? So who wants to answer this question?
I can come in quickly, although Andreas might want to pick up. But I think last year we did see this kind of agreement to have a just transition mechanism, which will need to be operationalized this year. And I think it's going to be very critical that in the design of that, it's kind of brought closely together with a lot of the other initiatives currently taking place, particularly on the mitigation side, to make sure, for example, that in the roadmaps process, that a just, orderly and equitable transition is considered. So yeah, strongly encouraging kind of making sure that process is not happening in a siloed fashion, but is really kind of connected to action across the piece to make sure that the transition is just and equitable.
Thank you, Cosima. So these are the questions. There is one about global methane plates. So it was also in my notes. So I'd like to say something about that. As Bengisu already presented the action agenda items, the zero waste is on the top. So this was an expected item because it is a flagship initiative of Turkish government. On the other hand, in order to merge zero waste agenda to climate change agenda or mitigation agenda, obviously the methane reduction was quite also on top. Although, as Andreas said, methane share of waste emissions as methane is only 3-4% in the global greenhouse gas emissions. So this regarding that coal phase out is one of the weak spots of Turkish government here, that carrying methane emissions on top while not talking about coal phase out is going to be questionable. So that's for sure. This is going to be discussed before and during the COP. So we'll see what happens. But on the other hand, this is also a very important point that although Turkey is carrying zero waste on top, and also the methane reduction is one of the priorities, but as you probably know, Global Methane Pledge, which was signed by 160 countries, was not signed by Turkey. So this is also quite a big question when we really expect Turkey to sign Global Methane Pledge before the COP31. This is one of the expectations, actually. One other note from me is in terms of when you are talking about negotiation groups, as you probably know, Turkey is not in any negotiation groups. So this is problematic in many ways during the negotiations, but maybe during the presidency, this could be an advantage. I don't know. So we'll see also if it is going to strengthen Turkey's mediator role or not. So this is also an interesting point that I forgot to mention in the beginning. And also one other note from me that Turkey is emphasizing action agenda a lot, at least in this early stage. Then this is normal, by the way. But on the other hand, we see that sometimes that action agenda and negotiations agenda are a little bit mixed up. So I think this is also one of the important points that we need to take seriously, that yes, action agenda, especially in this era of implementation, is very important. But on the other hand, we cannot downplay the importance of official negotiations and COP decisions with consensus. So I think we need to take care of that. And the last point is also can be a question if you want to answer any of you, if anyone uh, has an answer, because as you said, especially Cosima mentioned about that, this implementation accelerator was an important outcome of COP30 last year in Brazil. And this year, as we saw from the draft action agenda, the climate action implementation mechanism is also a very important priority for Turkish government. And how they will complement each other or how they will work together is also one of the questions. I don't know if you have any answer, please.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's all to be shaped at the moment. I think this climate action implementation mechanism, and we've seen some ideas already from the Turkish presidency side, kind of link in between the national NDCs and real world action, and trying to kind of facilitate that link, working closely with the NDC partnership and Climate Promise and other organizations to build the conditions that they can be implementable. The global implementation accelerator still needs to be shaped. At the moment, it's just those three words in a text. Although the Brazilians do have some ideas on the form that this will take, and they kind of see it as a kind of mechanism which will identify where there are, where we're close to positive tipping points, and then redirect resources towards them to try and kind of, cross those positive tipping points and create the momentum that takes forward different actions. So I think it's, it is complementary to kind of have that, high level vision of where do resources need to be directed, and then drive that forward. But this is up to the presidencies to shape, and I haven't heard anything yet on how Turkey, how Australia are seeing that Brazilian vision, whether they will continue that, whether they will build on that, whether they're envisioning something else, whether they've even started thinking about this global implementation accelerator. There's a lot of open questions that need to be shaped. Otherwise, I think the GIA will risk just becoming, another initiative which doesn't quite have a home. So, I think it's also our task as civil society and other people thinking about this to build ideas on what this could be to be most useful to the process.
Thank you. And lastly, if you have any questions to ask, please share, although we have a little bit of time, but still, if you want to share anything else or last words or last questions. Okay, so if not, thank you very much. So it was very fruitful discussion, and it was a great start for dialogue and discussion about COP31. As Istanbul Policy Center, we will continue this webinar series with different topics. For example, probably we will address the Turkish-Australian modalities in the next webinar, which is also a very interesting topic. And in some other topics, we will see each other again. And thank you very much for your contribution once more. And thank you for the cat also, that the contribution, it was lovely. So thanks all, and thank you for your participation to all attendants, and see you next time.